As we learned last week, the three Shavuot are the central basis of religious anti-Zionism. We looked at what the three Shavuot were. They were learned out of verses from Shir HaShirim, that Israel will not go up b'choma, with force as a unit, into Eretz Yisrael, that Israel would not rebel against the nations of the world, and the nations of the world would not oppress Israel too much. So we examined exactly how to understand those, that according to Rashi, and that not to go up b'choma meant with force as a group, but individual aliyah or aliyah by permission would be allowed, and according to some, even obligatory. The second thing that we looked at was Sar Pachad HaShavuot, that once the nations of the world have given their permission, that at that point the Shavuot no longer exists, similarly to the way that when Koresh gave his permission to return to Eretz Yisrael and rebuild the temple, that the Shavuot no longer existed. The next point we want to look at is Hadadiyut HaShavuot Tluyot Zo B'Zo, an interrelationship, that the Shavuot, the oaths, are dependent one upon the other. As I noted in the beginning, is that the first two Shavuot are Shavuot that the Jewish people take, and because the third pasuk in Shir HaShirim is slightly different in form, therefore the third Shavuot is a Shavuot that the nations of the world take. There are several Gedolim from the previous generation that explained that there is a connection between the obligatory nature of the three Shavuot. The Shavuot of Shelo Yishtabdu Behem Yisrael Yoter Midai, that the nations will not oppress the Jewish people too much, is their keeping that Shavuot is what obligates Klal Yisrael in their two Shavuot. In his Sefer HaTekufa Gedola, Menachem Mendel Kosher, who was the Ger Chassid who the Rebbe sent to establish Ger Yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael for the first time, wrote in his Sefer Tekufa Gedola, at the end of the Sefer, in the name of Shlomo Kluger and Rabbi Hillel Kulomeyer. Shlomo Kluger was one of the greatest of the Rabbanim in Hungary, Poland border region about 150 years ago. So he writes in their name, Vim hamelech ve'amemshala ovrim al hashvua v'rodvim et Yisrael u'mishabdim imahem, that if the king and the government would pursue the Jewish people and transgress their Shavuot and pursue Israel, and enslave them, as Rasha Yisrael gam ken lavor al Shavuotam, then Israel would also be permitted to transgress their Shavuot. Or perhaps better, that there is no longer a prohibition on Yisrael of the Shavuot. The Rebbe from Satmar addresses this complaint in the following statement. It's number 2 on our list from a Rebbe in Vayoel Moshe, page 90. V'yesh apikorsim she'omrim, and there are heretics that say, shekeven she'umot lo kaimu et hashavua, that because the nations of the world did not fulfill their Shavua, Lechen yesh gam lanu chas v'shalom heter lavor ala Shavua. Therefore, we have permission to transgress the Shavua. V'zei hevel hevalim she'ein elu hashavuyot shuvuyim zeh b'zeh. And this is a vanity of vanities, of course, borrowing the language from Kohelet, that the Shavuot are not dependent upon one another. The Satmar Rebbe continues relating to the words of Shlomo Kluger, who he cannot dismiss as an apikoros, because he was one of the major poskim that the Hasidic world, certainly in Hungary at that time, his great-grandparents were people that, both his great-grandfathers are people that asked Shlomo Kluger shilos at different times. So he writes, "Ube'emes lo kasav zei hamaharshak, Rabbi Hamarenu of Shlomo Kluger, ela b'derech drush." He only wrote this as a manner of a drasha. Kederach hadarshanim hamachadshim pirushim shonim b'derech agada is the way of all of the speech makers that create new commentaries, new explanations in the way of telling a story. Afim einum lahalacha klal, even if it's not there, they have no intent for any halachic content. Hadrasha tidrosh ve'ein meshivim al hadrush. People can say whatever they want in a drasha, and we do not have to respond to a drasha. This is the Gemara says ve'ein meshivim al hadrush. This is a very famous concept, that when someone's making a drasha on a pasuk, that they are, unless they're saying specifically that it's a halachic matter, that you have no obligation to respond to his drasha. If you're making it another way, you can't then say, well, you explained it this way, but he explained it that way. You know what's going on, because as long as one of them is saying it is a drash, we don't have to relate to the content of what he said. What can we do?
Excuse me, Rabbi. To
yes.
whom is that addressed?
I didn't hear you.
To whom is that addressed?
The Satmar Rebbe, in his Sefer, the Satmar Rebbe wrote a major Sefer on Zionism. And this is the Satmar Rebbe's response to what Shlomo Kluger wrote. And Ein Meshivin al Drush is just a classic Talmudic statement of when someone is making a non-halachic drasha, that I do not have to respond to him if I am learning the psukim in a different way, al pi halacha. So the Satmar Rebbe is extending this concept and saying that because it's true that Rav Shlomo Kluger said it, but when he said it, he was saying it as a drasha, not on the Gemara, even though drashas are normally on psukim. He's saying this is a drasha on the Gemara, not as a halachic statement. Then Rav Drukman comments on what the Satmar Rebbe said. What can we do that the Maharshak, Marina Rav Shlomo Kluger, said what he said? But that explains this Satmar Rebbe. He says it only as a matter of drush, and we do not have to relate to matters of drush in a serious way. So Rav Menachem Kasher responds to the Satmar Rebbe, Umashik Kasev L'taretz Divrei Hamarshak, number 4, and what the Satmar Rebbe wrote to explain the words of Rav Shlomo Kluger, Osam Dvarim Mamish Yesh Lomar Al Rov Dvarim B'Sifro. This is exactly what we can say on almost everything that he wrote in this entire Sefer. The whole thing is a drush. The whole Sefer of the Satmar Rebbe is in fact a drush. It's not a halachic argument. It's a moralistic argument, which is in fact what a drasha is, saying that we have that Zionism is false and that there's nothing to it, and so on and so forth. As soon as you get into that type of discussion, there is no longer a discussion. If you're saying I may be dismissive of the person because what they're saying is a drasha, then the ability to discuss is now gone. Meaning, my mind's made up, I will not allow you to confuse me with facts. All right. The next section, Hashvuot Mivatot et Gezerat Hagalut. That the oaths are an expression of the decree of exile. I have a quote, start with a quote from Rav Drukman. In our discussion until now, we have accepted a basic understanding that the three oaths, hen isur olam, they express a prohibitions. Ulam, however, that's not necessarily true. Havanazu malei b'sefer mispar tmiot. This understanding raises a number of questions in our mind. Reshit, the first. What was the way that the nations of the world accepted the prohibition of not afflicting the Jewish people too much? Anu kibalnu et hashvuot kshelamadnu et Masechet Ketubot. When we learn Masechet Ketubot, so we accept that we have these two Shavuot, or perhaps assuming that they are the pshat, the simple meaning of the psukim in Shir Hashirim. When we accepted Shir Hashirim as part of Tanakh, it could be that we accepted these Shavuot as well. But how did the nations of the world accept the fact that they're bound in an oath? For someone to be bound in an oath, there are several ways of saying it. They can say, I swear such and such. Someone else can say, I am making you swear this. And they can say, yes, or amen, I will accept that as an oath. Or you can hear someone make a shavuot, and you can say, gam ani, I also will be bound in this shavuot. But we find no reference in our Gemara to any way in which the nations of the world became obligated. Ve'sheila nosefet, another question. Shelo yishtabdu b'hem Yisrael yoter midai, that they will not afflict Israel too much. Mahu agid shel yoter midai. What is the measure of too much? Achrei kol mashi hishtabed banu, after everything that has happened to us. Meaning, first of all, how do you define it? Normally, whenever Chazal say something, they define what it means. For instance, the Chumash tells us in Yom Kippur that we are supposed to afflict our souls. And part of affliction of the soul means that you're not allowed to eat or drink. So how much eating or drinking removes the affliction of the soul? So the rabbis give very exact measures. You can eat up to this amount, and it would not be a Torah violation. It would be a rabbinic violation, but not a Torah violation. You could drink up to a cheekful, and it would not be a Torah prohibition, and so on. How much food do you have to eat to be obligated in Birkat Hamazon? How far are you allowed to walk outside of the city on Shabbat, and so on and so forth? The rabbis give exact definitions of it. But what does it mean? Shelo yishtabdu behem Yisrael yoter midai, that they will not enslave or afflict the Jewish people too much. What's too much? How do we measure that? The Maharal Prague has an entirely different way of looking at it in his Chidushei Agados on our Gemara and Ksubos. And he writes as follows: Kasher Hashem Yitbarach Gazar Hagalus al Yisrael, when the Holy One, blessed be He, decreed exile on the Jewish people, the Hagalus Hazeh, or Lefi Seder Haroi Liot B'olam, and this exile is not according to the normal way in which the world functions. Ki lo nimtza she'uma tiyeh gola v'yeh yoshvim b'toch uma acheret. We do not find that a nation is exiled and it is living in the land of another nation. Rak kol uma v'uma hi tachat rushuta. Each nation is living in its own place. Ve'Hashem yitbarach gaza hagalut al Yisrael. But Hashem, he should be blessed, decreed exile on the Jewish people. Ve'agalut hazeh einu lefi seder haroi sheyeh ba'olam. And this is not the normal way in which the world exists. Lefi chachai Hashem yisbarach gozer kiyum al galutam. Therefore, he had to decree make decrees that would would create the possibility for an extended exile. It is true that we have people that leave their country and retain some identity with it for a period of time. It can be a few hundred years. But we don't see people that were exiled 1,000 years ago who haven't acculturated and become part of the people of where they are. Even, by the way, even in much less time than that. If you look at the change of the borders of Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War from before the Second World War, the Russians moved Poland 200 miles west. They took away from Germany. The Polish border moved into what had previously been Germany, and the Russian border moved into what was previously Poland. It was a buffer that Russia wanted. Today, if you go to these areas, the areas that were German-speaking are now Polish-speaking, and the people living there consider them Poles, and the people in the part of what was then Poland, they're now Ukraine, Russia, whatever, view themselves as part of this nation and not part of Poland. Even though there are fights over whether certain districts of the Ukraine should be Russia or not, we have not heard of parts of formerly Poland saying they want to go back and be Poland. This is something that doesn't seem to exist. People move. You also have, for instance, Irish Americans who identify with their Irish identity, but they don't seem to have the same desire to go back to Ireland and so on. If you ask them what their nationality is, they say Americans, not Irish. There might be Irish Americans. They have an identity with it, but they're not. This isn't what they are. So we see that exile is a change in the basic nature of the world. The Maharal talks about this a lot in the first chapter of Netzach Yisrael. Because in the nature of the world, when people live in their place. When people move from place to place, they become assimilated to what they are. However, even though Yisrael was not living in its land, it maintained its own separate identity. Therefore, to allow Israel to maintain its own separate identity for so long, you needed specific decrees from God to make it possible for them to survive the entire period of the exile. The Maharal continues, not immediately, we discuss other things that aren't directly related to or not needed for our discussion now. In source 3. V'im lo hayta hagzera hazot al davar shehu keneged haseder. If this decree was not for something that was against the normal nature of the world, ein lo kiyum. There would have been no possibility for them to continue to exist. Ki hatar gover alav. Because the normal Seder of the world would overpower him. Therefore, there was a necessity to create 3 oaths. Kolomar shlosh gezerot. That is 3 decrees. Ha'achad shlo yu bittel or el hagalut atzmo. That there would be no negation of the exile itself, right? That Israel wouldn't leave the exile. That as long as the exile was supposed to be extant, Israel would not be able to go up in great numbers to Eretz Yisrael. That Israel would not be capable of taking their land by force. Lo ye tosefet, lo ye giraon. There would be no addition or taking away, meaning that Israel couldn't rebel against them and create their own land someplace else. I know the Soviet Union tried to create a Jewish home region, but never took off. And that they wouldn't be annihilated. They wouldn't cease to exist in exile. Hare Gimel Gezerot, Shebizei Hagalut Omed al Inyan Harishon. These 3 things are necessary for exile to in fact exist. Kima Shelo Yalu B'choma. What does it mean that they will not go up by force in number? Davar Shu Gruim Hagalut Kasher Hagalut Hu Hapirud. The nature of exile of the Jewish people is that they should be separate, divided, not unified. And for this to happen, we can't join together. V'hem yalu b'choma b'kibutz l'Eretz Yisrael hari davar zeh nechshav giron hagalut. If the Jewish people could have gotten together and gone up to Eretz Yisrael as one, this would be a diminution of the exile. V'lo yishtabdu b'hem yoter midai, and that the nation shouldn't work over tax them. Utosefet galut. This would be an addition to the galut, causing it to go longer, causing it to be unable to end. V'shelo yumradu, that they wouldn't rebel. It's interesting that the Maharal has reversed the order of the last 2 oaths. Davar zeh neged hagalut. This is against the exile. The Jews cannot function. It would be impossible for them to do something to end the exile. Kasher yumradu ba'umot, when they rebelled against the nations of the world, v'lo yikiblu ol shalehem, they would not accept their dominion over them. Ein kan galut, there wouldn't be exile. There would be something else. They create their own state someplace. They'd be their own independent people, whatever. They go to Uganda. Hari lecha gimel dvarim elu hen amidat hagalut. So you see that these 3 things are those things that make exile possible. Without these 3 things, there would not be the possibility for an extended exile. So according to the Maharal's understanding, the Shavuot are not prohibitions. They are divine decrees of the nature of the world to establish that Israel would stay in exile for the required time, not more and not less. These words of the Maharal are an incredible chiddush, an incredibly new thing, and a different way of our understanding the context and the subject of the oaths. There never was a prohibition of going to Eretz Yisrael. Shelo yalu Yisrael b'choma. This is a divine establishment that wouldn't be possible for Israel to do it. As long as exile is supposed to be extant, it will not be possible for Israel to enter as a group by force Eretz Yisrael. And so too with the other things, that they would not be able to revolt. and that the nations of the world wouldn't oppress them too much as long as they were still supposed to be in exile. In order to keep the non-natural nature of exile extant, only these three things could have existed. Shelo yimradu ba'umot ha'olam, that the Jews would not rebel against the nations of the world. This is the decree that is exile. That Israel would be subject, submissive to the nations of the world. And the other decrees are not the essence of exile, but the nature of exile. That they can't go back, because if they could go back, it would end the exile, right? And that the nations of the world would not afflict them too much. What does it mean too much? It would so that they cannot continue to exist as a separate unit wherever they are. So these three oaths are establishing how the Jewish people will live in their exile. It is not only the Maharal Miprag that said that the Shavuot are not prohibitions, but they are gezerot. This can also be found in the Tshuvot of the Rivash, 1200s, 1300s, from Spain. Source 4. Umi shehiglam, and the one that exiled the Jewish people, lo haya menicham l'shuv, he would not allow them to return, ad sha'alu b'reshut Koresh, until they were received the permission from Koresh. Begam ata, and so too now for us. Achat mishlosh shavuot sheishbiya hakadosh baruch hu Yisrael shelo yalu kachoma. So too, that we are not allowed to go up because of one of the three Shavuot that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that we would not go up with choma as a group by force. The Rivash writes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not allow Israel to go up until the time of Koresh, meaning it may have been that people desired to go back from the exile, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not allow it to happen. And so too in our exile. If so, it is reasonable to say that the other two Shavuot are just like this one, that they are divine decrees and not halachot binding us, that they are nature of the world statements. For the period of 2,000 years that the Jews were in exile, they had a spiritual connection to Eretz Yisrael. They loved it, but there was no movement, practical movement to make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. They always viewed Eretz Yisrael as Hilchasel Mashiach, as a law for the Messianic era, and that's something practical. And this is an outflow of the nature of these three Shavuot, of these three divine decrees. One should also note that the three Shavuot were not brought by a single one of the poskim. The Rif, the Rambam, the Rosh, the Tur, the Shulchan Aruch, not one of them brought any of these three Shavuot in as a psak halacha. They weren't a matter of isser v'heter, what's permitted and what's permitted. It was a reality. More than this, the Ramban establishes in his commentary to Sefer Mitzvot. Now, the Rambam wrote a Sefer Mitzvot. Half of it is his Hakdama, his introduction, explaining how you determine whether something is one of the 613 mitzvot or not. The other half is a list of the mitzvot. Now, the Ramban has disagreements with the Rambam, and sometimes he takes out from the Rambam's list of mitzvos certain mitzvos. If he takes out, then he has to also put back in. If you look in the Rambam, there is no place where the Rambam says that there is a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban, in his addition to the positive mitzvahs, as the 5th edition says, V'lo nezva biyad zulatenu. We are commanded to, at all times, to not leave Eretz Yisrael in the hands of someone else, min ha'umot, of the nations of the world, or l'shmama, or to allow it to be desolate. V'u amru lahem, and he said to them, V'orashtem et ha'aretz v'yashavtem ba. It's Bamidbar 33:53, that you will inherit the land, you will cause yourselves to inherit the land, and you will live in it. Hare nitztavenu b'kivush b'chol hadorot. Behold, we are commanded to conquer it in all generations. Mitzvah aseh l'dorot mitchayev kol yachid mimenu. This positive commandment for all generations obligates every one of us, ve'afilu b'zman hagalut, even in the time when we're in exile. Ki yadua b'Talmud u'b'mkomot harbe, it is well known in the Talmud in many different places. So you see from here that at least the Rambam felt that the Shavuot were not a prohibition, because if the Ramban felt that the Shavuot were a prohibition, he could not conceivably say that there's a mitzvah incumbent upon us to go up to Eretz Yisrael at all times. What is it like for Jews that live in a place where you can't find the 4 species? Right? Eastern Europe was a place by that. Are you going to say that the Jews are exempt from fulfilling this mitzvah? No. They simply could not perform it because it was outside of their ability to perform. The Ramban is saying the exact same thing concerning the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, that there is an absolute mitzvah to do it. It's simply that we're not capable of doing it right now. We're under force and not able to do it. We should do whatever we can to do it. We can't do it. We can't do it. The Yeshua Smalko that we've discussed before, Rabbi Yoshua Mikutno, said, Ubeprat ata, and especially now, Shur'inu et shuka agdola, when we see this great desire, hen b'anashim b'chute erech, we've seen this quote before, whether they're people less value, hen b'beinonim, normal people, hen b'yisharim b'votam, and those upright people, b'karov l'vadesh notzetz ruach ha'geula. It is almost certain that the spark of the spirit of redemption has been lit. And we should remember here the words of the Torah Tamima that we brought above when we discussed the words of Rabbi Yoshua Mikutno. It is, the Torah Tamima writes, V'yitachein od deromes l'masha amar b'ktuvot, that this is a hint to what it wrote, that was written in Ketubot. Kol ha'oleh miBabel le'Eretz Yisrael over ba'aseh shenamar v'yishbati etchem d'im toru et ha'ava lalot le'Eretz Yisrael ad shtechbatz. That he says, I adjure you, if you will wake up the love to go up to Eretz Yisrael until it is sated. Kolomar, this is to say, ad shialu ratzon me'akadosh baruch hu, until God desires it, until it's God's desire. V'imken kshenase hitor root klalit la'alot, when there is a general desire to make aliyah. Ot hu ki higia hasha haritzuya. This is the sign that the desired time has come. V'zehu, and this is what it means. Imr ita safsalim leim bavlim munachim be'eretz Yisrael. If you see the benches filled with Babylonians sitting in Eretz Yisrael, kolomar ribui ha'olim. This is to say, an increase in the number of people making aliyah. Safei l'raglav shel Mashiach. You have to look for the footsteps of Mashiach. Rotze lomar. This is to say, O2 ki kavar omdot raglav b'shara Yerushalayim. We have a sign that his feet are sitting in the gates of Yerushalayim. According to our words that we've seen here, we have to go look back to what the Or Sameach wrote when he was writing about the San Remo Accords. Source 8. Amnam, but now, ke'et hesava hahashgacha, when divine providence has moved events of the world, asher be'asafat mamlachot ne'urot b'San Remo nitan tzav, when there was been a gathering of the enlightened nations in San Remo, and the order was given, asher Eretz Yisrael tiye la'am Yisrael, that the land of Israel would be given to the nation of Israel. The kevan shesar pachad hashavuot, once the fear of the oaths has been removed, v'rishayon hamalachim kama mitzvat yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and with the permission of the kings of the world, the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael has been raised up again. Sheshakula keneged kol mitzvot shebetorah l'mekoma, that is equal to all the mitzvahs of the Torah. It has been returned to its place. Mitzvah kol ish l'sayeya b'chol yochalto l'kayim mitzvazu. There's a mitzvah incumbent upon every person to help with this mitzvah. What does the Or Sameach mean when he says kevan sar pachad hashavuot? Because the fear of the shavuot has been removed. The Or Sameach understood well the ideas of asur and mutar, what is prohibited and what is permitted. If he thought that we were talking about a prohibition, he would have written kevan shesar iser hashavuot. He would have said, now that the prohibition of the oaths has been removed. Why is he using the word pachad, the fear? That's something else. So he's telling us that there never was a prohibition. There was just the fear of caused by the divine decrees. However, when the nations of the world in San Remo adopted a resolution, there is no longer such a fear that exists, and it's exactly the same as what existed in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Just like we have these three Shavuot, there are other Shavuot as well that exist. In the Zohar, we're told, Amar Rabbi Yudai. Rabbi Yudai says, Amar Rabbi Yesa, in the name of Rabbi Yesa. This is, in the Gemara, this would be Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. These are nicknames the Zohar and the Yerushalmi often records the same Tanaim by their nicknames, not by their formal names, whereas the Mishnah and the Bavli always record them by their formal names. Nishba HaKadosh Baruch Hu shelo yikanes Yerushalayim de le'ela ad shikansu Yisrael b'Yerushalayim l'tata. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu swore that not to enter the heavenly Jerusalem until Israel enters the earthly Jerusalem. And also, Rabbi Yochanan says in the Gemara in Tanit, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Lo avo b'Yerushalayim shel mala ad she'avo l'Yerushalayim shel mata. I will not enter the upper Jerusalem until I enter the lower Jerusalem. This is the Shavua that binds us. According to it, we have to be in Jerusalem down here so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can enter the heavenly Jerusalem. When we return to our Jerusalem down here, it's as if we're helping HaKadosh Baruch Hu to return to the heavenly Jerusalem. And this, of course, is, Drukman doesn't write about it, but this, of course, write about it here. But this, of course, the only way for the temple to be rebuilt is for it to first be rebuilt above, and then it can descend or be rebuilt below. So to create the possibility of HaKadosh Baruch Hu being present and allowing the spiritual developments which would cause the possibility of the temple to be rebuilt, we have to allow HaKadosh Baruch Hu to enter the heavenly Jerusalem, and to do that, we have to enter the earthly Jerusalem.